books out of the book drop for this. We just have people go directly to the website.
Craig Buetow, thank you very much.
Thanks.
According to David Horowitz, 101 left-wing radicals have taken over departments at universities around the country and are using their positions to promote their own political agendas. The Professors, Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Human Genome Project Director Francis Collins argues that God makes science possible and that science and faith complement one another in his book, The Language of God. This talk from Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. is just over an hour.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dr. Collins, whom I've known for many years. Dr. Collins is many things. He's a superb scientist. He's director for many years of the Human Genome Project and now director of the National Center for Human Genome Research at NIH. He's someone who is deeply and thoughtfully concerned about the ethical issues and implications of the genetics research that he has led for many years. And he's an enthusiastic teacher and scientific leader. Francis is also a committed Christian in a scientific community not always highly tolerant of such beliefs, to say the least. Although I must say, when my late husband was very ill a few years ago, he was a scientist, and he was amazed at the number of people who wrote to him who were scientists, whom he had no idea believed in God, that they kept it on the quiet. Francis has written a book that is a wonderful story of two paths taken. One, a path to science, and the other, a path to God. It's a fascinating book and very well and clearly written, and it's a respectful book. It's respectful always and deeply of science and his colleagues in science. And it's also respectful of the beliefs and practices of his fellow Christians. This doesn't mean that it is a book without strong views and strong opinions on some of the most contentious debates of our time, especially evolution, although I can't believe I'm even saying that it is a hotly debated topic. It clearly is. It's hard to imagine how many more trillion fossil shells we need to really get the belief systems going here in terms of evolution. Dr. Collins is much more tactful than I am. Some scientists have said that the last thing that science needs is more discussion of religion. Fortunately, Francis disagrees and is trying to create a more thoughtful and tolerant climate for the exchange of very strong ideas and strong beliefs. Finally, Francis is a passionate, exuberant man, and his book not only conveys that, his wonder at nature, his wonder at the beauty of the world, the privilege and delights of being a scientist, but he also makes it clear that such passion can be directed at God as well as at understanding the laws of nature. Dr. Collins.
Okay, thank you so much for an incredibly generous introduction. And for me, having written the first book of my career, to be introduced by somebody who I admire so much as a writer is really an incredible compliment. I can't imagine anybody I would rather have make those opening remarks, and so thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I could tell from the reaction of the entire group when you were introduced how much you are held in high esteem by anybody who reads books. Robert Jastrow, the noted astronomer, wrote, "When a scientist writes about God, his colleagues assume he is either over the hill or going bonkers. I hope I am neither. And yet I have done that thing. I have written about God, and I've written about science." How did I come to write this book is a question that some have asked me in the last couple of weeks since it came out. And I was very much influenced by the experience 3 years ago of being asked to give a series of 3 lectures in the evening at the Harvard Memorial Church, an endowed lectureship that has been going on for 100 years, called the Noble Lectures, which had the intention of bringing somebody to the Harvard campus who would reflect upon some way in which faith was relevant to the modern world. And I was asked to talk about how faith might be relevant to science. That was a somewhat intimidating experience. I had thought much about those topics since I became a believer at age 27, but to put them together in a fashion that would hopefully achieve some coherence was another challenge. And I expected perhaps a few dozen students would turn up and probably drift away quickly after the topic was fleshed out. Well, that isn't what happened. For 3 subsequent consecutive weeknights on cold February evenings in the middle of Harvard Yard, hundreds of Harvard undergraduates turned out for a conversation about science and faith and whether they are in fact compatible or whether they are incompatible. And they asked penetrating questions, and it was clear to me that most of the people who were there did not already have a view on this. They were seekers. They were trying to figure out, from their perspective, looking at the data from science and looking at the evidence of belief, what were their views going to be? What worldview would they choose? And it was clear from conversations with some of them during and after this that they were hungry for that kind of conversation. Now, I don't think Harvard undergraduates, although they're a very bright group, are drastically different than the rest of the world. And so it seemed clear that this is an area where there is a desire for dialogue, and the dialogue has not necessarily been happening because the stage has been dominated, it seems, by the extreme voices on either end of this spectrum. We have on the one hand some of my colleagues who, as scientists, are also atheists, arguing that science, particularly evolution, demands atheism. We have on the other end of the spectrum people of strong religious persuasion who are convinced of the literality of Genesis 1 and who therefore do not trust science to reveal facts about the age of the universe or the relatedness of species. Young people, oftentimes caught in the middle between these extremes, don't know what to do. And the message that I wanted to put forward in this book is a really, I hope, good news in this contentious debate, and that is that you don't have to choose between these ways of finding truth. They are different ways of finding truth, incredible value, and that you can be, as I am, both a rigorous scientist who demands to see the data before drawing a conclusion, and somebody who believes in a transcendent God, a God who created the universe and who's interested in each of us as individuals. How did I get to that path of belief? It was not by having been raised in a household where faith was practiced, because that was not my story. I was raised in an incredible environment, rich as it was in exposure to the arts, to theater, to music, but not to faith. And when I got to college, in those late night conversations in the dormitories that happen oftentimes at that point in one's life, I became pretty convinced when we talked about God that I wasn't interested. It was convenient, of course, not to be interested. I was at that point in my life where there were lots of temptations, and I was just as happy to give in to them and not worry too much about whether there was a standard that I should be living up to. I then went off to graduate school in quantum mechanics, of all things, and I became convinced that everything could be reduced to mathematics, physics, that anything that really mattered could be written out as a second-order differential equation, because that's what you do in quantum mechanics. And I became not just an agnostic, but an atheist. And I was pretty obnoxious about it, in fact, and it was sort of part of my job, it seemed, on an encounter with anybody who mentioned something about faith, to point out to them that that was really a throwback to a past era and something that they should just get over. But then I had a change in my own path, which was precipitated by a realization that this particular area of science that I had chosen, as exciting as it was on a daily basis, was maybe not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And that was particularly true because I got exposed to what was happening in biology. Recombinant DNA was just coming along. It was clear that things were happening in a field that I'd pretty much ignored. And not knowing what else to do, I decided I'd try to keep all my doors and options open, so I went to medical school. Why they let me in is not quite clear. This particular speech about my desire to be one of the nation's future doctors must have seemed a little thin, but somehow this was accepted by those good people at the University of North Carolina. And off I went to learn how to be a physician. And that was gloriously exciting. And I continued my atheist perspective for a while. But then, as one does as a third-year medical student, thrust out into the hospital wards, made to face up to the fact that terrible things are happening to nice people, that illnesses that people have done nothing to bring on themselves are happening right and left to truly wonderful human beings. And as I tried to help and often couldn't, I got to know some of those good North Carolina people, and some of them told me about their faith and what an enormously powerful rock they felt they were standing on, and that they were ready to face anything, even death, without fear. I assumed that was a psychological crutch, but it was obviously a pretty strong one. And that made me curious. And on one afternoon, an elderly woman who had really terrible heart disease that caused her a great deal of chest pain on a daily basis that we weren't doing a very good job of managing, she told me about her faith and how really this was not something that she was fearing, although we had nothing much to offer her. And then she turned to me and looked me square in the face and she said, "What do you believe?" I hope somebody asks all of us that at some point, because you kind of need to be able to ask yourself that question in the context of it being asked by another person. And I stammered and I stuttered, and I had my atheist perspective, but suddenly it felt very thin, and I said, "I guess I don't know." And I walked out of the room and I was troubled, and I remained troubled for the next several days, because I began to realize that I had done something a scientist is not supposed to do. I had drawn a conclusion about a really important question, is there a God, without looking at the evidence. Scientists aren't supposed to do that, right? And I realized I'd never given a moment's consideration to the arguments for and against. I assumed there just weren't any arguments for. And the only people who believed were those who had arrived at that conclusion because of family upbringing or culture. And I realized if I'm going to be an atheist, I've got to be a better atheist. I've got to be able to defend my atheism better than I did that afternoon. So off I went to try to learn about what faith was all about, and I found it all very confusing. And so I went to visit with a minister who lived down the street in Carrboro, North Carolina. And I asked him to explain something to me about this, and I asked him all sorts of questions, many of which were probably blasphemous. And he patiently tried to answer some of them and said, I see where you're coming from, and you are somebody who really is looking for some kind of logical explanation for why faith could be a reasonable perspective for a thinking person. I have just the book for you. And he took a little book off of his shelf, and he said, "Go home and read this." The book was Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis's incredibly thoughtful, incredibly well-argued treatise on the plausibility of faith. And as I turned the pages of that book, all of my arguments against God lay in ruins by about page 3. And I realized just how much those arguments had been based on really naive schoolboy ideas. And as I got deeper into the book, I began to be convinced that while rational argument cannot bring you all the way to becoming a believer, you could certainly go down that path to the point of admitting, and I had to admit, that belief in God was more plausible, more rational, than saying, "I know there is no God." That became the least rational of the choices, because that assumes you know enough to be able to say, despite the limits in my understanding, I can be absolutely certain that there is no God. That hit me between the eyes as a position that a thinking person really should not take without committing an enormous act of arrogance and hubris. But I didn't like that conclusion, and I was particularly troubled because Lewis seemed to be reading my mind. Every time I would come up with an argument that challenged what he had said on page 29, well, on page 30, he would come back at me with why my argument actually had a hole in it. And I began to realize why that was, because here was a man who had traveled the same path that I had, an Oxford scholar who was a committed atheist and who set about to try to shore up his atheism and accidentally converted himself. And that's what happened to me. I was particularly convinced by this argument, and I remain convinced by it today, when it comes to the existence of the moral law. This knowledge of right and wrong that we all have, that is characteristic of our species, human beings, and which you do not find in other animals on our planet, This knowledge, which we all have, and which we try sometimes to listen to and sometimes choose to ignore, is something which, from my perspective as somebody who studies evolution and DNA, cannot be fully understood on the basis of those arguments. Because you see, the moral law sometimes calls me to do things that are not good for my propagation of my DNA. Think about it. Who are the people we most admire? They are people who have done sacrificial acts, who have put their very lives in danger to help others. Mother Teresa, Oskar Schindler. Those are people who we consider to have represented sort of the pinnacle of human noble action, the altruistic effort, the agape that Lewis talks about, the kind of love that seeks no recompense, that is purely a love that wishes to help others without expectation of benefit. What is that all about? Evolution would not expect that. Evolution is all about whether that individual is going to propagate their DNA or not. If I'm walking down the river and I see somebody out there drowning and I'm not a good swimmer, evolution is going to tell me, move on. If that person is my worst enemy, they're particularly going to, evolution will say, move on. You win. But that's not what I feel in my heart. It's not what any of us do. There is that still small voice that calls you to do something sacrificial. And I find that a very compelling signpost towards the possibility of a God who not only created the universe, but who has an interest in us as human beings and who stands for what is good and holy. So this is not a deist God. This is a theist God who cares about human beings. Those arguments for me were incredibly compelling at age 27. But I resisted, and I had many doubts, and I ran away as fast as I could. But ultimately, I couldn't run fast enough, and the need to face up to this reality overtook me. After many months of studying various religions of the world, I became quite taken by the fact that the person of Jesus Christ was a special kind of faith because of his claim to be God. No other faith made that outrageous claim. And I couldn't see how you could both call him a great teacher and say he wasn't who he said he was. And so, while I recognize that every person has their own path to travel here, and this may not be the path for many of you, for me that became a compelling argument. And ultimately, I became a Christian at age 28. But can a geneticist be a believer? Well, happily, I'm here to say yes, and I'm not the only one. In fact, a poll was taken of working scientists a few years ago where they asked the following question: do you believe in a God to whom one may pray in expectation of an answer? That was the question. They had asked that same question in 1916. 40% of working scientists said yes in 1916. In 1997, they asked that question. 40% said yes. Does that surprise you? Where are all of those people? Because they are not exactly sharing that information. And you know why? It's because I don't think the scientific community is particularly welcoming to those kinds of discussions. There's sort of an unwritten taboo. You can talk about almost anything that has to do with the natural world, but oh, please, let's not go into the spiritual stuff. They might think we'd gone soft. Scientists have a rigorous approach to understanding things in nature, and things outside of nature really don't fit that mode. And so, quite appropriately, science is not the way to understand those questions, and we scientists, therefore, just don't talk about them. But there are lots of people who believe, as I do. Asa Gray, who is the major proponent of Darwinism in the United States shortly after the publication of The Origin of Species, was a devout believer. Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the best-known evolutionists of the 20th century, was a devout Greek Orthodox believer. These are compatible views. And yet that seems, in many ways, to have faded away in the current, often shrill debate about whether science is compatible with faith. What have we learned from the genome about this? It has been my great privilege to lead thousands of scientists in 6 countries over the course of 13 years to read out our own instruction book, all of the 3 billion letters of our DNA code, now laid out there on the internet in highly accurate form, in order to enable us to go to this next step, which we're now very much into, of understanding how that works and how it can play a role in developing better methods of disease prevention and cure. And that is a very exciting interval indeed that we're into. I can tell you that by studying our DNA and comparing that with many other organisms, which we are now able to do, we have genome sequences on more than 30 different species now. The argument in favor of the relatedness of living species by descent from a common ancestor is overwhelming. And one cannot explain really what we see in the genome by any other means. That, of course, is a terribly distressing statement for some believers who are attached to a literal interpretation of Genesis 1 that argues that humans and other species were created by multiple acts of special creation as opposed to coming about by an evolutionary path. But I do not see why that conclusion is required by a reading of the text. I am a devout believer in what the Bible tells us, but I don't think Genesis 1 was intended to be a scientific textbook. And I'm not alone in that. I take comfort in the writings of St. Augustine, who in 400 AD, before there was any reason to worry about evolution and to be apologetic about his opinion, wrote very compellingly after considering Genesis, no less than 5 books about it. And in each of those, after wrestling with possible interpretations, he comes to the conclusion that really no human could know exactly what the writer of Genesis, presumably Moses, intended to convey in those opening verses. And that, in Augustine's words, very explicitly, we believers should not attach ourselves so strongly to a single interpretation of those particular verses that subsequent discoveries would cause that to be overturned and cause us and our faith to be put to scorn. Words which I think we really have to pay attention to. All too often, I think, believers, in an attempt to try to demonstrate their sincere dedication and devotion to their Lord, have attached themselves to narrow perspectives on particular scriptural interpretations which were not necessary by the original language of the text, and which, when subsequently shown to have cracks in them on the basis of scientific advances, do not do damage to science, they do damage to faith. Intelligent design, a recent arrival on the scene in this debate about evolution and whether it can account for human beings, once again, I fear, has stepped into this particular territory of postulating a God of the gaps, the supernatural need for intervention in the evolutionary process in order to explain some of these very complex molecular machines that we find within all living organisms. But already the cracks in that argument are showing from the scientific investigations of just the last couple of years. I would therefore really, as a believer and a scientist, hope that we wouldn't step into that particular way of thinking, because it does not only create this kind of tension between scientists and believers, it actually, I think, places faith at some risk of having been attached to a particular framework that turns out not to be justifiable once more data is accumulated. And it's unnecessary. So how do I put this together? You may be wondering. Okay, this is fine. He says he's a scientist. He says he's a believer in a transcendent God. How does that work? Well, here's how it works for me. I do believe that God created the universe, that amazing flash of energy 14 billion years ago that screams out for an explanation about how could something be created out of nothing. I believe that God did that creative action with intentions, not just to have some rocks and some gas floating around the universe, but the intention to have creatures, marvelous diversity of creatures, including one special type of creature with whom he could have relationship. That would be us. I believe that God chose the mechanism of evolution in order to accomplish that goal. And what may seem to us as a random process that took a very long time did not seem that way to God, who is not limited by the tyranny of this linear axis of time that we are. And so in that very moment, that very flash of the creation of the universe, God's vision also included human beings arriving on the scene in all of our fallen nature. It included having a special relationship with us, infusing us with this moral law, this knowledge of right and wrong that makes us different from all other creatures and which evolution alone does not seem capable of explaining. Infusing us, if you'll allow the theological term, with a soul, and giving us the opportunity to practice free will, which we have regularly done in ways that are against his will, and which have caused untold suffering amongst our own peoples, but which, in fact, is part of the plan. Now, everything I have just said, for me, fits what I know as a scientist and fits what I know as a believer. And I find this kind of harmonious synthesis enormously satisfying, because it makes my experience as a scientist one where, in investigating the natural world, I am also in some small way getting little glimpses into God's mind. And if you'll allow it, that means for a believer, doing science is also doing worship. That you are not only learning things about the mechanical aspects of what we see around us, but you are also learning something about the awesome genius of the one who made it so. I find that to be a wonderful way to spend my time. Now, some have argued that these have to be non-overlapping magisteria, as Stephen Jay Gould said, that you need to keep your spiritual worldview over here and your scientific worldview over there, because if they happen to get together at the same moment, your brain would explode. Well, mine's not exploding right now, and they are both coexisting, and they do so most of the time. I do think we have to be careful in that situation when you're asking a question to be sure what kind of question it is and which of these worldviews is most likely to give you an answer. But to my scientific colleagues who say the only questions worth asking are ones that science can answer, I would say that doesn't quite work for me. What about the question, what's my purpose in life? What about the question, why are we all here? What about the question, is there a God? What about that question, what happens after we die? Is it not clear that science offers you nothing in terms of answers to those questions? And either you decide, as some scientists have done, that they're just out of order and we shouldn't go there, or you have to develop some other pathway towards finding the answers. And for me, that pathway is the one that has been traveled down through the centuries by minds much greater than mine that have sought to seek through spiritual means answers to questions that only come by finding a relationship with God. So, to conclude, before we take some questions here, I think it is a great tragedy that we have had such a polarized circumstance, particularly in the last few years, that the stage has been so dominated by the shrill voices that claim there can be no rapprochement between these particular perspectives. Some of my own colleagues who say that because of evolution, atheism has to be the only choice of a thinking person. Again, I would argue that that is the least rational of all choices. And to my fellow believers, for whom I have great respect, who have argued that because evolution is not compatible with their current view of Genesis 1, that it must be wrong, I beg you to think of the consequences of taking that stand. And think of those young people at Harvard who are trying to figure out where they want to place their faith and their belief for the future. They will not be attracted to a faith that denies a vast array of scientific data. They will not be attracted to a faith that says, well, you know, the data is there, but it's really there because God put in some evidence to try to fool us and test our faith. Does that sound like the kind of God that one would want to worship, who becomes a cosmic trickster, who basically sets things up so that the universe looks as if it's 14 billion years old when it's really only 6,000? That doesn't seem like a compatible position, and yet I've heard that position put forward. And I know as I say those things, that sounds harsh, and I do not mean to be. I really have great compassion and understanding for the sincere views of many believers who are concerned that if you start tinkering with any aspect of the literal interpretation of any verse, then you're starting down a slippery slope that will throw out faith altogether. But you know, we're mature adults. We live on slippery slopes all the time. When you look at the words of the Bible, there are parts of it which are clearly the record of eyewitnesses, and we better not tinker with those. That's talking about history, and that's most of the New Testament for me. But when you look at Job, or you look at Jonah, or in fact you look at Genesis, it is not clear to a sincere believer exactly how much of this is intended to be literal truth and how much is to teach us about God's character and about his plans for all of us. And in those circumstances, attaching myself to Augustine, I would say we would be better off to anchor our faith in the love and grace of God and not in some narrow interpretation of a small part of these Holy Scriptures that we're fortunate enough to have in front of us. So, in this book, I try to put forward that kind of a synthesis. I don't expect it will be for everyone. If it, in a small way, starts some conversations that weren't happening in all kinds of venues, the scientific seminar rooms, maybe a little bit, the churches, maybe a little bit, the coffee houses, the bookstores like this one, maybe a little bit, then I will feel it was worth the task. But I don't want any more of those Harvard undergraduates, or all the ones like them, to feel that nobody's talking about this. And I would give one more exhortation, and that is what this book is really trying to do, that we should be discussing these issues. If we're interested in truth, there are all kinds of ways of finding it. If we're interested in knowing, science is not the only way to do that. If we're interested in being whole creatures, not just mechanically oriented individuals, then science and spirit have a great deal to offer us to live out that fully experienced kind of human life. For me, anyway, that has been an amazing gift, an amazing surprise, and one that I deeply cherish. I thank you all for your attention. I'd be glad to answer questions. And as was said at the beginning, if you have questions, please come to the microphone here so that they can be heard, especially by the folks who are listening on C-SPAN. Yes, sir.
Hi. I would love to see you in a debate with Richard Dawkins someday, who will be here in October, I think, with his new book. The question is, Daniel Dennett recently put out a new book called Breaking the Spell, and he
Yes.
was here and spoke to us. And he, I don't know what to do.
Do we have any technical advice here about how the microphone could
here comes
acquire
somebody.
some volume? Maybe it's on, but not enough. Thank
Should
you.
I start over?
Yeah, start over. I'm not sure everybody could hear.
I would say
Much better.
I would like to see you in a debate with Richard Dawkins someday.
I know Richard quite well, and we've had conversations.
And it would be a great event to see, I think. My question is about Daniel Dennett's new book, Breaking the Spell, who was here this year talking about it. And as a scientist, I think he challenges humans, and all of us, especially scientists, to examine religion and try to understand it as a human event, as a human behavior, to understand it because it's so impacting upon our lives. Now, as a scientist, what do you think of his call for humanity to actually examine this thing that impacts our lives and our culture and our future so dramatically?
So who could argue with the premise that something as important as faith ought to be subjected to discussion and close scrutiny? Where I depart from Dennett is that his presumption is, from the beginning, as an atheist, as he is, that the way in which one scrutinizes faith is to basically demonstrate how it is a purely human invention. That is his premise, and he argues that we should come up with other ways of conducting research that would demonstrate that to be correct. His particular perspective does not allow the possibility that there might actually be eternal truth hiding within these faiths, which he views as a purely human social invention brought forward by years of culture and maybe even by some evolutionary advantages, although I think those turn out to be the kind of just so stories that don't hold up very well when subjected to scrutiny.
With the Western world largely having developed in the Judeo-Christian tradition, how now do we best incorporate Islam, Judaism, Buddhism into our framework?
So that's a great question, and one that has no easy answer. I must say, although I'm not an expert in all of the faiths that you just mentioned, I have studied all of them to some degree, and it seems to me that the great religions of the world have a great deal in common, and I think they would not have long survived if they did not. They hold within them the kind of truths that are eternal, that are going to stand the test of time no matter what else happens in our world. They do obviously have differences. I think if we could spend a little more time focused on the areas of commonality, and they're very major, instead of focused on the specific areas of difference, we might have a better chance of understanding each other. My own faith pathway led me to Christianity. That is, for me, the faith that had the greatest meaning and which I now ascribe to as a way of finding truth. But I know that is a very personal kind of pathway, and I would just urge anybody who hasn't actually looked at that comparison to do so and see where you come out. Nobody can really tell you what their answer is. You have to find that one yourself. Yes.
Hi. I'm speaking from one of those great faiths. I'm Rabbi Lynn Landsberg. Hi, and I used to be the rabbi in Stanton, Virginia, which is right around the corner from where you grew up.
Indeed, indeed. Nice.
And when you talk about the Creator God, you talk about, you sound like you can be coming from somebody from the Talmud or the Mishnah, because you discuss about how we think, how existence versus sacrifice is what evolution versus sacrifice is just doesn't work for us. It's sacrifice comes first, and evolution comes second, and that's such a Jewish way of thinking. So my question is it linguistics or the fact that you said God is a he that it's a part of your faith?
Your point is very well taken, and I probably need to acquire a better linguistic style in this regard, because I know that is the use of a personal pronoun in a way that some people are troubled and offended by, and I by no means mean to commit that kind of error. It is one of those manners of speech that I don't seem to have quite managed to rewire my brain for. So when I say he, please assume that I am talking about Almighty God, whose gender I do not know. You're a great tutor. Okay, I'll sign up. Yes, sir.
I also have taken a journey similar to yours, but have come to slightly different conclusions. I mean, there may very well be something like consciousness may be a dimension, for example. In other words, the problem I have with standardized religions is not to reject them. It's just, it's too hard a packaging of what this greater consciousness may be. I mean, we talk about the morality of God, but if you look around, the animals eating the animals, that's pretty nasty business going on out there to have to survive. So what I'm suggesting, and I'd like to hear your comment on it, is that we don't necessarily have to arrive at the traditional point, but we should be using science and all the religious thinking of the past to possibly reconsider what the possibilities are for this higher energy, and not try to stamp it as though we absolutely know, not to anthropomorphize it, but just to take science, take the tradition, and allow ourselves the openness to possibly go forward with something that might need some adjusting.
I think many people are on that path towards incorporating all kinds of perspectives and new information into trying to understand what that entity is that we call spirit. And I can only tell you in my own path that has been a journey that I'm still on. I think anybody who is a believer who tells you I've got all the answers now is probably stuck somewhere that they ought not to be. We all have to grow and develop in this regard. I will say, though, that I do believe that ultimately there's truth in there somewhere, and the effort that all of us should seek out is to find what really is the truth of the matter, as difficult as that may be. And for me, I think the truth comes partly from these philosophical and theological arguments in a general abstract sense, and they come partly from having access to texts that have been down through the ages given the stamp of spiritual authority that I think it does not come by accident, but actually represents something very significant. And putting those things together, here's where I am. But I think, as you point out, we probably ought not to be stuck in any particular place and be absolutely confident that's the whole answer. Yes, sir.
In the creation of universe, with the thousands of galaxies and thousands of bodies and so on, or solar system is such an inconsequential thing, and our planet, and that is a little speck, and human beings on that. Was that specifically chosen human being? Are we the only beneficiaries of this endowment from God?
I don't know. If you couldn't hear the question, yeah, the question is if the Earth is such a small speck in the scale of the universe as it is, are we the only creatures that have been specially chosen by God? Are we all there is? I don't know the answer to that. There's a lot of people interested in searching for life on other planets. There's the famous Drake equation that goes through a calculation of how likely that would be, that there would be life, intelligent life, in other places that we might ultimately be able to make contact with. And unfortunately, the various coefficients in that equation are not possible to really define. You have to guess at them, and so you could have all kinds of wildly different answers depending on your guesses as to the coefficients. To me, that's a very interesting question, both scientifically and in terms of our understanding of our place in the universe, but it's not a question that would, I think, threaten my faith if the answer came out one way or the other. If Almighty God decided, through the process of creating the universe and all of the things that we know about in our planet, to create human life, why could he not do the same thing in some other location? Would that dilute him? Would he be too busy to keep track? That doesn't seem to me like something that would be a problem for Almighty God.
Perfectly all right. There may be other places where other intelligent beings like us with other moral forces.
I think that's possible. I think that's possible. By the way, I didn't mention it, but since we're talking about our small place in the universe, one thing that I find particularly compelling as a scientist in terms of the idea of God the Creator is this whole argument about how incredibly unlikely it is that our universe came to be. If you look at the constants in cosmology and physics that are basically set at the value they have, there's no theory that can determine them. Things like the weak and strong nuclear force or the force of gravity. And you imagine what would have happened after the Big Bang if you had tweaked those constants by even, in one case, 1 part in 10 to the 14th, which would be 100 million. If you change that constant by just that amount, then either the universe would have gone on expanding forever without any coalescence of gas and stars and planets, or it would have come back together again so quickly, the Big Bang would have been followed by a big crunch, that there would not have been any opportunity for life to come to pass. I think that's fascinating. We live on this knife edge of improbable, the big crunch. Well, people argue about that. I don't think we'll be here to watch. Yes.
Thank you for sharing your faith story. I noticed that the subtitle of your book describes the evidence for belief, and you mentioned C.S. Lewis, who certainly takes a logician's approach to faith in his opening chapters. And I'm wondering how you would respond to people who say that faith ought to be a leap and not based on evidence or logic or those sorts of more deductive reasoning.
That's a great question, and I think both are right. I think logic for a person who thinks in those particular kinds of arguments, as many scientists do, is a critical first step. If you are at a place where you have to say to yourself, belief in God is completely irrational, it's going to be tough for you if you're a rational person to get there. So for me, the argument that Lewis is putting forward in his book, and many others have written about this as well, brought me to the point, from pure logic, of saying the existence of God is plausible. But that's not faith yet. That is sort of preparing the ground. That is getting you to the point where you say, okay, I don't have to commit intellectual suicide to be a believer, which is what some of my colleagues have been telling me all these years. Actually, it's possible to be an intellectually consistent and fulfilled believer, but I still am not a believer until I take that leap. That leap is called faith, and there's no substitute for it. If we could prove God's existence, we would all be subscribers to a consistent faith, and we're obviously not. And science isn't going to get you there. And so while you may argue yourself right up to the edge of the cliff, you still have to decide whether you're going to leap. And in fact, it was that fear of leaping that held me back for a good year before finally taking that step, a step that I have never regretted. Thanks.
Doctor, that leads into my question about taking the next step and never regretting it. I would be interested in knowing whether you paid any significant professional price for coming forward with your profession of Christianity, and if so, what was it?
I don't really think I have, although some have likened writing this book to taking a public bath. Because it is a kind of personal revelation that scientists don't usually engage in, especially when it comes to this topic of belief. Most of my colleagues, I think, are very respectful of this perspective. As I said, 40% of them actually agree with it, and I've gotten many responses and emails from people in that category saying thank you for saying openly what we all believe, but are a little inhibited about speaking about because of our concerns about how that will be received by our colleagues. I think it has probably been helpful to me to have thought about this for a long time. I've never been quiet about my faith, but certainly not this open about it. And perhaps it would be more difficult at an earlier point in one's career where you're worried about getting tenure and worried about sort of how you're going to be viewed in the scheme of things as you're trying to build your own scientific reputation. Maybe I'm just old enough now to be able not to care quite as much about that.
My question has to do with theism versus deism.
Yes.
I was very interested in the part of your talk in which you try to reconcile the science and the faith. And I was just wondering about whether that really washes what you said. On the one hand, you said there was an intentionality of the God, the Creator, associated with the Big Bang. That intentionality involved a being that evolved into one that knew right from wrong and could make choices accordingly. On the other hand, theism attaches itself to the notion of immanence. If that intentionality was already posed at the beginning and involved intentionally an evolution that was already set in motion at the beginning, where does that leave the notion of immanence?
So will you define immanence for the group that may not be as familiar with that term, and define it for me too, to be sure you're using it the same way I do?
The presence
one
of
those
God.
Theological things that we might all not see.
Yeah, the presence of God in the present.
Yes. So why can God not be in the present and also at the moment of creation? This is something I tried to say but maybe didn't say very well. We as human beings are limited in our understanding of how things work by the fact that yesterday came before today, which will come before tomorrow. If God has any significance and you're not a pantheist, then God is outside of nature. And it seems to me, therefore, plausible that God is also not limited by this axis of time. If that is a correct assumption, then God can both be there at the moment of creation, knowing its outcome, and also be here, watching that outcome unfold. And that might seem like a tough sort of headache-inducing concept for us because we're so limited in that perspective. But I actually find that resolves a lot of the issues of theistic evolution, which both allows God to have a plan, a grand, loving, benevolent plan, but also to be working in each of our lives in a way that we have the chance to interact with Him.
Dr. Collins, you spoke beautifully about how religion and science can and should coexist. But last week we saw how they don't always, and there's a dialectic between the two. I want to ask you specifically about President Bush's veto of additional stem cell research, and I want to ask you about the broader question of whether government and religion should influence what can and cannot be done in scientific research.
So I'm a government employee. I wrote this book as what we call an outside activity. So in the book, I actually have an appendix that talks about bioethical issues and has a whole section on stem cells. So now, as a outside activity person, I'll answer your question. I think we've had a great deal of heat on the topic of stem cells, and the scientific issues have often gotten lost in that heat. For me, I think the union of sperm and egg, the opportunity for a human life to come into being, is a very significant moment and deserves serious moral consideration. At the same time, I do believe there's a great promise medically for the scientific investigation of embryonic stem cells. I have a hard time understanding why it is more ethical, therefore, to have hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos sitting in freezers which have no chance of ever being reimplanted, as opposed to using a few of those to try to develop something that could help somebody with Parkinson's disease or diabetes or a long list of other disorders. I also think we've made a big mistake in the terms of mixing together two very different ways of creating a stem cell, one being the union of sperm and egg in the usual fashion to make an embryo, the other being this really remarkable thing called somatic cell nuclear transfer, where we take the nucleus from one of your skin cells, which has your whole DNA sequence in it. All of our cells have the whole book. And you convince it to go back in time and to become able to make other types of cells. That is not something that happens in nature. It is not something that, in my mind, has the same moral status as the union of sperm and egg, and yet we have equated those things in our arguments, and we've called both of them embryos. And we've used horrible words like cloning to describe the second one of those, and we've really tangled ourselves up in our terminology. I wish we could step back, which is probably not realistic, from the current very dug-in positions, and they got very dug in very early here, and really look at the scientific differences between those things and have a more serious discussion about whether, from whatever perspective you're standing, those are in fact deserving of the same kind of moral status that's currently being applied. But I'm probably being a little optimistic to think in the current climate that we're going to have that conversation anytime soon. Yeah.
This is a semi-hostile question, but
thank you for warning me.
But what part of being a scientist would you regard as being most supportive of being a believer, and what part of being a scientist is sort of gets most in the way? I mean, I'll just be really blunt about that. The average scientist has a lot of moral insensitivity toward other people. They just, they are every bit as motivated as the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, except those guys are lazy in comparison, from what I've observed. So anyway, I don't want to bias your answer, but I look at those. No, I'm not thinking about necessarily any kind of intellectual thing, but something that goes with the practice of being a scientist, just from your perspective.
So, I actually think, for the most part, scientists are not quite as you describe. They're people who are often motivated very much at their core about a desire to discover things about the world. And many of them who work in biomedical research are motivated by the desire to help people. And I think in that regard, that motivation is very close to the same mandate for healing that many believers feel as well. So I think the part of a scientist that is in some way, by some inner drive, determined to make the world a better place is the same kind of motivation that many believers have, and is a chance for the two to get together and agree quite strongly. The part of a scientist that gets in a way, I think, is the mindset, which is part of our training, that you really are not going to be interested in studying anything for which you cannot collect rigorous data. And that, if you carry it to an extreme, basically rules out any consideration of the spiritual out of hand. And that is an unfortunate extension of what should be rigorous thinking about nature, to say that's all there is. And you become not then a scientist, but a materialist. And I think that is the kind of risk that many scientists have fallen into. And frankly, I think when you look at scientific beliefs, as I said, 40% are believers. Do the other 60% say they're atheists? No. I think a lot of them simply haven't thought about it. It's like we're all so busy, and there are so many other things to do, and the topic makes you vaguely uncomfortable. And, I'll put that off. And maybe someday when I'm retired, I'll give it some thought. Well, God doesn't always give you the chance. Again, I would hope, as I have said in the book, that amongst scientists we could have those conversations a little more often, and that we would consider the possibility that a fully experienced life could include that perspective and not just the materialist view. I see I'm getting the high sign. 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hi. I had a journey that was the exact opposite of yours. I grew up with a lot of religious training, and in my teenage years rejected God. And for several reasons, and I'd like to bounce them off you because they're reasons that even in my adulthood I still believe. And one is, it's very hard for me to accept a God who is the source of morality, as you believe, who would allow so much suffering in the world. The other one is just more one of logic, and as a scientist, I'd be interested to hear your analysis of it. If you say that the world is so complex that it must have been created by a supreme being, then in my teenage years I was like, well, then who created God? And that's still something I don't think that believers have found an answer to. So I'd be interested to hear your
Yeah, those are
response.
great questions. I think the question of suffering is one which haunts all believers and non-believers. Why does this happen? And I think it gets in the way of many people accepting the idea of a loving God. The argument goes like this: if God was perfectly loving, he would want his creatures to be happy. If God was all-powerful, he would be able to make that happen. But the creatures aren't happy. So either God is not loving or not powerful, or both. But there's a flaw in that argument. I mean, it assumes the premise that our most appropriate experience on the planet is to be happy all the time. That God is this benevolent grandfather who at the end of every day would say, everyone had a good time. And that would be enough. But is that really God's plan for us? First of all, let me say, an awful lot of the suffering we experience occurs because of actions of our own people. And we can't blame God if, in the process of our being granted free will, we choose to use it in ways that hurt other people. And you can't expect God to suddenly jump in many times a day and prevent that from happening. But there are certainly instances where people suffer for reasons that are hard to blame on any other human being. What is that all about? There are no easy answers to that. I actually go into that quite a bit in chapter 2 of this book. And let me say one answer to this, which is a hard one. It's a hard one for me, is that God's purposes extend beyond ours. And one of God's priorities is for us to get to know him. And if God whispers to us when things are going well, he shouts when things are going badly. As Lewis says, suffering is God's megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And if the most important priority while we're here on this planet is to find out who he is and who we are, and perhaps to prepare for something else, then the absence of suffering is probably not the way to get there. And I recognize that that is not an easy concept to accept, but I've certainly been true in my own life. The times I have grown the most are the times when really bad things were happening and I had to come to grips with what really matters and where the rocks are that I can stand on, and not the times where things are going swimmingly and I can pretty much say, I'm in control here, I can handle whatever comes along. When things are going badly, I know that's not true. And I think we all know that's not true. In terms of your second question about God's, who created him, again, it comes back to this issue of time. The reason we are demanding to say what created the universe is because the universe obeys the laws of time. And there had to be a beginning 14 billion years ago, and we cannot imagine what came before that. But God is outside of those rules. And so it seems to me God is also outside of the rule of having to have someone create him. All of those arguments we make about sort of something having to be before and something else having to be after do not apply to the supernatural God that I worship. And that solves the problem for me, although I grant you it still puts you into a metaphysical realm that many can debate about for a long time. Last question.
I just wanted to make a comment and also ask you a question. The comment is, I don't think it's the conflict between atheism and religion is solely between God and science. If you add up all the scientists from the beginning of time, most of them probably were religious and believed in some kind of God.
Yes.
And scientists, like you said, a lot of scientists do believe in God, but a lot of atheists know nothing about science or in a profound way. So it's not that science is disproving God or the other way around. You can run PCR or do high throughput microarrays without any opinion about whether it's a Christian God or Islam God or whatever God.
Absolutely true.
But
it's called science.
Yeah, so I don't think a scientist is in some way impairing his career by believing in some kind of God. But So my question is more, so I don't see this as sort of this ultimate fight between science or religion, but my question is more practical, because nowadays, if you don't, I guess, if you're not a religious charity, then you don't get the tax dollars, or if you're not, and tax dollars from other, people who don't believe in Christian God as well.
So I'm sorry, what's the question?
But my question is more practical. As a physician, what do you think about pharmacists and medical doctors who refuse to prescribe morning after pills, birth control, etc., in rural areas where there's limited medical access because of their faith? That's my question.
Okay, we got there. That's a very difficult area. I don't know that I have an easy answer. I would certainly be sympathetic in both instances with the people who need those services, but also I'd be very sympathetic with somebody who's a caregiver who has a strong moral stance that they should not be required to do something which in their view violates that moral stance. So I think we have a certain obligation to protect that as well. Obviously, if we had a better healthcare system where people had access more easily to healthcare broadly across the nation, that would be less of an issue. I take your earlier point too, that the perceived battle between faith and atheism is not one that is solely conducted on scientific grounds. But I do think in the current wars, at least as I see them, that science is being used particularly as a weapon from the atheistic perspective by many individuals. Dawkins was mentioned earlier. Certainly he would make that argument. I'm sure he will when he comes to talk about his book, The God Delusion. You can tell where that's going. So, and I will admit that I'm a scientist. This is the world I live in. This is where I see the battles. These are the battles that break my heart. These are the battles that I see young people, particularly in college, faced with courses in biology, but also faced with the great religious traditions and led to believe that they have to pick between the two because they can't both be right. That's what upsets me. That's what breaks my heart. That's the sort of circumstance we're in right now, which I hope we can get past. So let me just conclude by reading you the last paragraph of the last chapter here, because it's all about that. It's very brief. It is time to call a truce in the escalating war between science and spirit. The war was never really necessary. Like so many earthly wars, this one has been initiated and intensified by extremists on both sides, sounding alarms that predict imminent ruin unless the other side is vanquished. Science is not threatened by God. It is enhanced. God is most certainly not threatened by science. He made it all possible. So let us together seek to reclaim the solid ground of an intellectually and spiritually satisfying synthesis of all great truths. That ancient motherland of reason and worship was never in danger of crumbling. It never will be. It beckons all sincere seekers of truth to come and take up residence there. Answer that call. Abandon the battlements. Our hopes, joys, and the future of our world depend on it. Thank you all very much.